In this particular series, I am attempting to talk about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I'm beginning with the history of the conflict, and then I'm going to talk about the present day. But the only way to understand the present is he who understands the past. In the previous video, I talked about how the Ottoman Empire controlled Palestine, or modern-day Israel, whichever one you subscribe to. I'm not here to tell you what to think or how to think. I'm just here to give you the facts, and you're intelligent enough. You have 21 billion neurons in your cerebral cortex. You can make that determination. The Ottoman Empire controlled that territory. After World War I ended, Great Britain ended up drawing out the maps that created the modern Middle East, and they controlled Palestine under a British mandate from 1917 to 1948. If you don't know about the Ottoman Empire, how they controlled that territory known as Palestine, and how World War I led to this present-day strife, I recommend you go watch that video. In this one, I'm going to continue to move forward on the historical timeline. Basically, Great Britain had an oxymoronic position. They wanted to, on the one hand, create an independent state for the Jewish people under the Balfour Declaration. I got into that and dissected that in the previous video. While also, and their quote in the UN mandate is, they wanted to protect the civil and religious rights of the Arab population. Of course, as the saying goes, when you try to make everyone happy, you end up pleasing none. Both sides had tensions that began to rise during the mandate period. And the British, they faced difficulty trying to create a compromise. The Arabs had an event called the Arab Revolt of 1937-1938, where they revolted against the British government. They did this because they were afraid of becoming a minority in their own country. The British were encouraging Jewish immigration. After the Arab riots, Great Britain essentially, they restricted Jewish immigration. That pissed off the Jews, who then started creating militia groups that went against the British. They ended up bombing the King David Hotel, decimating it, which was the headquarters of the British government. Due to all that happening, the British decided to wash their hands of the situation in 1947. Another reason, as I was doing some research, I read pro-Palestinian books, I read pro-Israeli books, I've just been looking at all different factors, is that the British had trouble at home. Basically, the British, there was a big snowstorm. The snowstorm froze the coal deposits. The coal is what powered the Britain economy. It powered the TV stations, it powered the radio stations, it powered their ships, it powered their cars. They literally had to shut down roads due to it freezing. And after it was done freezing, they couldn't ship any more coal deposits because the coal was frozen. They literally had to get soldiers to try and chip and knock the ice, which froze the coal deposits, and they couldn't do it. Right before that happened, the Labour Party, who was in control of Great Britain during that time, basically said, we're going to nationalize the coal industry. That made them look bad. They nationalized an industry, and right after that, the industry had a situation happen to it. For political reasons and for economic reasons, because Britain had a lot of their animals die off, they had to re-ration foods like they did during World War II. They decided that they would leave Greece and Turkey. They would pull out their troops and their mandate for those territories. They would leave India for good. And they would also leave Palestine. They would wash their hands of it, and they would let the UN do what they wanted with it. That's when you had the UN Partition Plan of 1947, officially known as United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181. It proposed the division of British Mandatory Palestine into two separate states, one Arab and one Jewish, with Jerusalem and its surrounding areas placed under international administration. The plan allocated approximately 55% of the land for the Jewish state, while the remaining 45% was designated for the Arab state. Officially on November 29th, 1947, 33 countries voted in favor of it. 13 against and 10 absentees. Of course, the Jews voted in favor of it to have an independent state, while the Arabs and all the Arab countries voted against it. Surprisingly, the Soviet Union voted for it. The U.S. under Harry Truman voted in favor of it. What's interesting, though, and we'll get into this in a minute, I'm going to get into the aftermath and some of the individual countries involved, their motives and things like that. The Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin actually did more to help Israel gain its independence. The U.S. didn't do anything, and we'll get into that, other than vote. But here, Harry Truman is seen as the modern-day Cyrus. Cyrus was the king of Persia who freed the Jews from Babylonian rule and let them go back to their homeland to build the temple. Harry Truman is seen as the modern-day Cyrus, but Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union actually did more to help Israel. And without him, they wouldn't have become independent. We'll get into that in a moment. There are the bullet points here. You can look at the battles, you can look at the weapons, and I did all that. I'm a history nerd. I'm a history nut enthusiast, as they would call it. Kings and Generals is a good channel. There's some interesting documentaries for free you can watch about this stuff, about the battles and things like that. But basically, you had the partition plan that I just got into, the strife where both sides fought one another, atrocities were on both sides, the declaration of Israel, their independence, May 14th, 1948, the invasion by Arab states, the battles for control. You had them in big cities and you had them in little countryside areas. It was all around. The siege of Jerusalem, which was fought for control over Jerusalem. And then you had the armistice and the Palestinian exodus. Let's go over some of the individual countries involved. But first, let's talk about the aftermath of what happened. Israel gained control of a significant portion of territory. The war was influenced by military developments and ceasefire lines established at different stages. The armistice agreements that were signed between Israel and the neighboring Arab countries established temporary borders known as the Green Line. The Green Line demarcated the boundaries between Israel and the West Bank, then under Jordanian control, and between Israel and the Gaza Strip, then administered by Egypt. Israel's territory at the end of the war included the areas allocated to it under the UN partition plan, as well as some additional territory beyond the partition boundaries. Statistically, Israel ended up controlling 78% of the territory originally allocated to the Jewish state by the UN partition plan, including the coastal plain, the Galilee region, and a significant portion of the Negev desert. The remaining 22% of the territory was divided between Egypt, who got the Gaza Strip, and Jordan, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which occupied these areas until the Six-Day War in 1967. I just got done reading a great book about that, and I'll get into that in a couple videos from now. It's worth noting that the 1948 war resulted in the displacement of a significant number of Palestinians, with hundreds of thousands being forced to flee or being expelled from their homes. This remains a contentious issue. You still have these military camps too. Gaza, that's what Gaza is on the Gaza Strip. But they got that territory in the Six-Day War from Egypt. We'll get into that. But Egypt essentially lost that territory. But essentially what I meant to say was Israel during war, what they do is they get into a war. They get territory that is promised to them called the Green Line, but they want more. And after every war, it seems they end up gaining more territory because they don't want to sign the ceasefire agreement. They want the Golan Heights. They want, and we'll get into that, they want the Gaza Strip. They want parts of the desert on their border with Egypt. We'll get into that later on. Here are some of the countries involved. Jordan. In the fall of 1947, a number of meetings occurred between King Abdullah of Jordan and high Zionist leaders. These resulted in a secret agreement under which Abdullah would keep the Arab region out of any Arab invasion to the lands designed to Israel by the UN, and Israel would stay out of the West Bank, designated for an Arab state, and East Jerusalem, which was to be internationalized. Because of his ambitions to extend rule into the West Bank, Abdullah had no interest in destroying a Jewish state within the UN boundaries. In fact, he preferred a friendly Jewish neighbor to a hostile Palestinian one. Abdullah kept to the secret agreement during the 1948 war. At no point did the Arab Legion attack the Jewish state's territory, seizing only the northern half of the West Bank and Arab East Jerusalem, which had not been assigned by the UN partition. Neither the Zionists or the Palestinians. There were, however, clashes between the Arab Legion and Israel forces, but Israel instigated them. When Israel attacked areas near Jerusalem that had been assigned to the Arabs only, thus the Legion's successful aggression was only against Israeli attacks. They were acts of defense. They were not aggression, and were in strict accord with the pre-war Zionist Jordanian agreements. And Jordan at this time, it was called Transjordan. It was actually created by the British under their partition, and the king was sort of a puppet of the British Empire. Egypt, the most important Arab state, was not a reluctant and half-hearted participant in the 1948 war. Before the war, King Farouk of Egypt made several efforts to explore the possibility of a peace settlement with Israel, provided it would cede part of Gaza and a narrow strip of the Negev desert to Egypt. From November 1947 until May 11, 1948, the Egyptian authorities initiated no steps to prepare for war and stacked everything on a last-minute diplomatic solution. Part of Egypt's motivation was security. It feared further Israeli expansion and wanted a territorial buffer zone. Turns out Egypt's fears were well-founded. For Israel during the war deliberately provoked further clashes with the Egyptians in order to seize all of the Negev and parts of the Sinai that had been allocated by the UN to the Arab state. Second, Farouk was in a dispute with Jordan, and he sought to prevent them from grabbing all of Palestine. Even after the war began, Egypt continued to seek a way out of it. In early October 1948, knowing the war was lost, Farouk sent secret peace agreements to Israel, offering to conclude a separate peace treaty and stay out of any future Arab-Israeli wars, but on the condition that Israel ceded parts of the Negev and Gaza to Egypt. In short, not only was the 1948 war between Egypt and Israel avoidable, but on reasonable terms. But it is highly unlikely that with Egypt on the sidelines, the other Arab armies would not have attacked Israel, and possibly this would have no effect. And if they signed a peace agreement, you also might have not had the 1956, and that's the next video we'll get into, the Suez Canal crisis, the 1967, 1970, and 1973 wars. Syria. The Syria invasion force was small, about 3,000 troops, badly organized and poorly armed. The primary goals of the Syrian government were to prevent Abdullah, the king of Jordan's army, from seizing all the West Bank, which would cut Syria off from the northern Jordan River and Lake Tiberias, the main source of fresh water in the region. During the war, the Syrian army succeeded in capturing a small strip of land on the northeast border of the lake. The status of that tiny piece of land became the central issue in the various secret Syrian-Israeli peace talks that continued in the ensuing decade. Other than the fighting near Lake Tiberias, the Syrian army remained, by and large, out of the war. You always hear this from a lot of people who are biased for Israel. Again, I'm not biased for one side or the other. I was going to say one side or the either, but one side or the other. They try to make it like poor Israel, they accepted the peace agreement. When they decided to become independent, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria and the Arab League states all went after them. But the truth is, they were trying to sign peace agreements with Israel behind the scenes, diplomatically. Israel ended up taking more land during the war than they were allocated under the UN partition plan, and all of them didn't have one organized goal in mind. Egypt didn't think about, oh, we want a Palestinian state. Jordan didn't think about wanting a Palestinian state. Neither did Syria. They all wanted to stop the other side from getting more territory. And after the refugees were expelled, they didn't make an attempt to create one Palestinian state. Their goals were not aligned. We're about finished, but here is some of the Western countries. Czechoslovakia provided weapons to Israel. The Czechs were facing economic troubles as the communists tightened their grip in 1947 and 1948. Access to American credits struck as an idea to be pursued. The Soviets allowed them to sell worthless Nazi surplus weapons to the Jews. The Czech government would receive tens of millions of dollars as Israel purchased as many weapons as they were willing to sell. The Soviets let the Czechs ship the weapons across the Eastern Bloc territory in disguised crates due to not letting the U.S. find out, and the national arms embargo. Stalin's motives were strategic. He wanted to harass Great Britain who aligned with the Arabs, while also driving a wedge into the alliance of Britain and the U.S. Great Britain's puppet regimes weakening would in turn weaken and frustrate Britain's Middle East strategy. Without the U.S. military shipments, Israel would not have won the war. The U.S. during that time, Truman accepted an embargo on all American sales to either side. The Arabs were well supplied with arms from Great Britain. The Jews had nowhere to turn. Meanwhile, American arsenals were bursting with surplus material from World War II. While Truman recognized Israel as a nation and the U.S. supported the partition plan from the UN, Russia did more than America did. So basically, Stalin, as a pragmatist, you can say what you want about Stalin. Yeah, he's a piece of garbage, and if hell's real, he's in there right now. But he's a smart guy. He wasn't stupid. That's why he hung on to power for so long. He thought, I'm not going to directly fund them, but if I let Czechoslovakia fund them, they go through my territories in the Eastern Bloc. If the Jews end up defeating the Arabs, this will screw over the British and their puppet regimes like Jordan and Iraq. Also, at the same time, it will cause the U.S. and Britain's relationship to be strained. What's interesting enough is, close to his death, actually, Stalin did a 180. He decided that he wanted to, at that time, he wanted to commit atrocities and commit genocide against the Jews, but thankfully, he went ahead and died and went to hell before he could do all that. But that's where we're at now, the 1948 war. So Israel, to summarize, ended up, they were promised 55% of the land. They ended up taking 78% of the land. The Arabs moved to refugee camps that they're still in to this day. And all of this culminated into the next conflict, which is the 1956 Suez Crisis. That'll be the next video we get into, and how the U.S. allied with Egypt initially in the Middle East. They saw them as a better strategic partner than Israel. But we'll get into that in the next video.